Today's guest is Whitney Austin. In 2018, Whitney co-founded the nonprofit Whitney Strong, whose mission is to find common ground to end gun violence through data-driven, responsible gun ownership solutions. A Louisville resident, Whitney is married to her husband, Waller, and they have 2 children. Thanks for taking the time to be here. I really appreciate you. I know you're very busy, and we appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us and have a chat.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to a new audience and to educate and inform people because this is a crisis.
Yeah, it is. And, at St. Vincent de Paul, we're there to, provide support for folks that are in need. And, the support that you're providing through Whitney Strong and the awareness that you're providing in such a balanced and thoughtful way is wonderful. And I really look forward to getting into that and letting our listeners know more about that.
Okay, good.
So if we could go back to 2018. I know it's a difficult topic, but there's probably a number of our listeners that aren't familiar with the mass shooting at the Fifth Third headquarters in Cincinnati, which was September 6, 2018. If you could you take us back to that day? And I know that in that horrible incident, you were shot numerous times and miraculously survived, and we're here today, and so much has happened since then. But if you could talk to us a little bit, our listeners and viewers, on what happened, and just what happened, if you just bring us back.
Mm-hmm. So September 6, 2018 was the Thursday after Labor Day weekend, and I was accustomed to going up to Cincinnati, Ohio for my job at Fifth Third Bank. So just a normal day of going up to do my job as a product manager, and I did all the normal things that I would do on that trip. I remember talking to a few of my peers, listening to an American Banker podcast, and then jumping on a conference call with my legal and compliance partner as I took the descent into the city. And I always share that detail because I truly believe if I had not been on a work call, I would have had much more situational awareness for what was happening. But that was the case. I was on a conference call and I was really plugged into what we were discussing. And as I got into the city, pulled into the parking garage, lost connectivity, plugged back into the call, crossed 5th Street, just like I always do. Did not notice that the square was empty, should have. And when I got to the revolving door, there was some shattered glass, but it was still intact in the door. And I thought for a second, well, that's a little weird, but never ever thought that's weird because those are bullets and that glass is shattered because of bullets. And I just pushed with my right arm on the revolving door to try to enter the building, and that's when the first barrage of bullets struck me across my chest and my arms, and the force was intense and knocked me to the ground. And at that point, my brain kicked into gear. These must be bullets. Nobody's close enough to have stabbed me. And if these are bullets, this has to be a mass shooting because that's what happens in this country. I'm not someone who has any reason to be shot, and that's not to say people that have been shot for other reasons do, but these are the thoughts that were crossing my mind. Immediately leapt to, I need to survive. I have a 5 and a 7-year-old at home, and they need their mother. I have to survive. And when I looked out onto the square, there weren't any saviors there for me. I tried to stand up, and I was too injured across my arms to be able to push myself up. And my last idea was to call 911. And when I went to move my left arm to get back to my phone that I had dropped with the force of the bullets, my arm was just a dummy arm. I was never going to be able to use it at that point to get to my phone. But secondly, that signaled to the shooter that I was still alive. And that's when the next barrage of bullets came. And that was the moment of devastation. I don't have any way out of this. I'm not going to live. I'm not going to get back to my babies. And as a person of faith, that's when my faith kicked in and I started praying. And on a dime, and this is really crazy to think about, from the moment the first bullet came to the moment that Cincinnati police arrived was exactly 1 minute, 1:00. So I had all of these thoughts and all of these plans for survival within 1 minute. But they arrived heroically. They did everything expertly, and they took the shooter down. And then they immediately went to rescue me from that revolving door. And then that started a chain of events to continue to help toward my survival. So I waited on the square. They applied tourniquets to me. They called my husband to inform him as to what was going on. I can remember starting to feel the pain at that point because for me, I knew at that moment that I was no longer in danger, that the shooter had been killed. And so I started to feel the pain once I believed I was safe. And the ambulance came very quickly. I was very lucky to be within close proximity of a Trauma 1 center. And as soon as they got me into the hospital, they started doing their job expertly. And by the time I woke up, I was surrounded by my husband, my doctors, my nurses, and they said, "You're a miracle. You were shot 12 times, and none of the bullets hit any major organs or arteries." And believe it or not, I was so stable that I didn't have to have surgery until the next day. So it was the game over moment of my life, I hope. I hope that is the one and only. Where we just knew, Waller is my husband and I, we just knew that we had to pay this gift forward because nobody gets this.
Yeah. The prayer that you said, do you remember?
You made me cry thinking about it.
Do you mind?
It's just to take care of my family.
Yeah. That's what happened. You survived. That's part of the whole.
Yeah.
The whole trajectory, right? It's a miracle, it really is. Thank you for sharing that. I know it's very difficult, and clearly the trajectory of your life, to your point, changed completely that day, right? Not about, hey, I'm a wonderful mother, you're raising your 2 children and all that. Nothing changes there, but in terms of where you now choose to spend your time and what you're doing, completely changed that day.
Yeah.
In so many different ways, and I'd love to talk about that because, if I'm not mistaken, what I saw is that you actually started Whitney Strong within a month. Or really shortly thereafter, after the shooting, and I would love to hear you talk about that because when we think about gun rights and Second Amendment, there's so much that divides the country. That is clearly a topic that can be divisive and divides. But one of the things that I'm really interested in is that in your mission statement, you talk about common ground and you talk about a balanced approach to gun ownership, gun rights, and those kinds of things. Can you talk to that a little bit? Because that's very unique out there.
Yeah, we technically started Whitney Strong within 3 weeks of the shooting.
That's amazing.
And that's because there were so many amazing people in our support system that were willing to pick up the work and do it for us. I couldn't even use my fingers. I couldn't text. I couldn't type on a keyboard. It took months before I could use my fingers again. So a huge shout out to all the people that made it possible. But we knew right from the beginning, my husband and I, that we wanted Whitney Strong to go about this work differently. And that was in part because I had cared about this issue before I was shot, and I had been really paying attention to the landscape of many of the other organizations doing the work. But secondly, as we sat there in the hospital receiving texts and phone calls from a lot of people who love us, it was clear that it really didn't matter if you owned a gun or you didn't own a gun, or you were more conservative or you were more liberal. you are all united in this moment that what happened to the person you love is unacceptable and change needs to happen. And, I think that's a really important message to share over and over and over again, that we all agree that what's happening is not acceptable. We don't all agree on the solutions that can make a difference, but we all agree that it's unacceptable, and that's our starting point. And if you can lean into finding that common ground, you are on a better path toward progress than so many other approaches that are more about finding all the places in which we disagree and running in circles. And as someone who has been shot many times, I knew then, and I still know, that there's just no time for that. Any progress is better than no progress. And so that's the idea behind Whitney Strong. It's still the same today, more than 5 years later, than it was in that hospital room. We're just more educated today on where you can find common ground.
The reaction that you get from legislators and other leaders when they see that you're coming from that common ground place, what reaction do you get from that? Folks that have these fixed, insurmountable positions. It sounds like you're changing, maybe. It's hard to change a fixed position.
Yeah, there's a spectrum. There are certainly lawmakers that, I believe no amount of meetings and conversations and data or stories is going to change them. But by and large, we are lucky in our state that that's not what leadership appreciates in our legislature. And so those types of lawmakers don't have the power to legislate in that way. I'd like to say it's the same at the federal level, but right now I'd say it maybe is that way, that some of the more extreme politicians have more control than they should, which prevents progress. But I've not seen that at the state level here in Kentucky. Now, there's a difference between educating and having conversations and bringing more people into the legislative coalition versus passing a law. And we're not yet to passing a law. I wish I could say that we are, and that 2025 will be the year and we'll get the bill that we've been working on just like that. It's certainly possible that CAR, which is a temporary transfer law that allows us to use a civil legal path to temporarily transfer firearms away from people in crisis, get them the help they need, and return their firearms to them. I wish I could say that'll pass in 2025, no problem. But the fact of the matter is we probably still have a few years in front of us before we can cross that finish line. But where we are after session in 2024 is tremendously better than where we were when we started this work back in 2019. So for anybody listening that wants us to be at the finish line, I hear you. I do too. But that's simply not the way things work in a state like Kentucky, where this issue has been largely ignored. But as incidents of gun violence increase, and that includes accidents with our children, that includes suicide with our teens, suicide with our adults, mass shooting incidents increase, our lawmakers are learning more and more and getting closer to a point of making the right decision. So what I say is have hope, participate with us, and I promise you we're going to get there.
Yeah. Talk about, you mentioned mass shootings, and, that for folks that has a particular connotation. And, you all are an organization that's data-driven, and you make decisions based on informed decisions based on your findings. You mentioned all those other, suicide and accidents and all kinds of things. What is it? What have you all found from folks having those preconceived notions and stereotypes about mass shootings, and are the facts kind of behind that? That's where more of the problem is, or is it other areas? I mean, I could see where we could draw a conclusion that, well, that's where more of the problem is. I mean, we're just beyond the 1 year anniversary of here in Old National, but you mentioned all other kinds of areas that we need to be educated on. What are you all finding?
Well, I brought this book because it's one of my favorites. It's called The Violence Project: How to Stop a Mass Shooting Epidemic, and it's by two researchers out of Minnesota, and it's the most comprehensive book I've read yet on really who mass shooters are and what solutions could be put into effect to stop them. And I mean, I certainly wish that every American would read this book, because there are so many preconceived notions that aren't helpful in our fight to reduce the number of mass shooting incidents. I'll give you one really good example. I oftentimes hear that, the reason we have increased mass shootings in America is because of violent video games. Their research helps people understand that violent video games are not a cause of mass violence. Now, if you have someone that's going down that pathway of violence, and there are a number of reasons for that, it could be childhood trauma, for example. If you are someone that's going down that pathway, violent video games could be an accelerant toward getting you to that violent choice much more quickly. But playing violent video games alone, without any of these other factors, is not what causes mass violence. Another preconceived notion is just simply that there's nothing we can do about this. Prominent elected officials say there's nothing we can do about this. This is just the cost of freedom in our country. And that's not true. These researchers, and many other researchers for that matter, have a many number of solutions we could put into effect to make a difference. And by the way, not all of them are legislative solutions that have to be put into effect, but some of the ones that I always call out tie in really nicely to the piece of legislation we're working on, CAR, and that is understanding that most mass shooters leak their plans for violence. Now, it depends. It could be someone who is unknown to the soon-to-be shooter. It could be a loved one. But as a society, we really need to get to a place in which if someone tells you they're going to harm themselves or they're going to harm others, that we pay attention to that. And that doesn't mean, well, you're coming with me to the police station. That means that this person needs help. And we need to look into what support services in our community can really make a difference, because there are multiple examples in this book of people who were on that pathway towards violence, but sometimes the simplest interventions prevented them from taking that action. I'm not kidding. One of them was a young person who was ready to complete a school shooting, and he ended up at a friend's home, and the mother made his favorite pie. And that was enough to convince him that he didn't need to follow through on that act. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, not only do they leak their plans, most active shooters, are suicidal, whether that's prior to the act or during the act. So one of the things we do at Whitney Strong is educate people on the warning signs of suicide. Not only can you be helpful in preventing someone from taking their own life, if they're in that special place of, I want to harm myself and others, you could be protecting your community. And so really neither one of those things require legislative action, but you can start to see where if you have a city or a state that's educated on, I know if someone says that, I'm going to take it seriously. I know what these warning signs look like and to take them seriously. And then the last part is, if someone is in this position on this pathway of violence, the last thing you want for them is to have access to lethal means. And of course, firearms are some of the most lethal means. So it's not forever. We can help with an intervention. We can get you back to a place in which gun ownership is safe. But while you are in this crisis moment, we need to have a law like CAR, where we can go to law enforcement, we can work with social services to help you, but during this moment, you do not have access to firearms. And so I think those are some of the most important things to know about mass shooters, but there's so much more to learn, and this book is really a good start.
Could you mention the name of the book again?
Sure, it's called The Violence Project: How to Stop a Mass Shooting Epidemic, and it was written by Jillian Peterson and James Densley out of Minnesota.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So on CAR, is there particular pushback? Legislation is a process to get it to where it needs to be. may not be perfect, but it's better than maybe what we had before. Is there any particular pushback that you're feeling, with that? And maybe it's tied up in a lot of what you just said.
Well, a lot of the pushback we have resolved at this point,
Okay.
because we have been working on it over the course of 5 years. For example, in the beginning, there was pushback that who had access to petition the court was too broad. So we don't want a neighbor to be able to go to the court. We don't want a school principal, a doctor. We want it to be very narrow in scope. So for years now, it's been very narrow in scope. You can only go to law enforcement, and then law enforcement, who has a history of determining dangerousness, is going to determine, is dangerousness the situation here? And if yes, then law enforcement will go to a judge, and the judge is the second filter to determine should an order be placed on this person. So that's a good example. Another example is the window in time in which the respondent, that's the person in crisis, does not have access to a firearm before they have access to a hearing. And in 21 states across the country, that window of time is 14 days. And the idea is you kind of want to get a sweet spot between not depriving someone of a hearing for too long, but also giving them the opportunity to put their best foot forward. Because in a case of, which we think would be very infrequent, misuse or abuse, you're going to want to put your best foot forward. Let me bring my therapist to testify on my behalf as to why this, information is not correct or whatever it is. Because in that hearing, the opportunity exists to extend the order for a longer period of time, or to allow the order to expire and have the firearms to be returned. And so what we were able to do, now granted this was with our current sponsor, Senator Whitney Westerfield, who is retiring, and whoever takes over next year may have a totally different stance, but what we did under Senator Westerfield was to decrease that window to, I'm forgetting, it was either 6 or 7 days, but cutting it in half. And that was really best in class across the country to be able to move that quickly with it. So those are some of the areas of pushback. Others are really not valid. There are concerns from some that it's not constitutional to deprive a right in this way. But again, with 21 states across the country doing them, they have been challenged for that exact thing multiple times and have never been overturned. In fact, the most hopeful moment of my new career in this work was the passage of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act in 2022 at the federal level. And as part of that legislation, they put dollars aside for any state who passes one of these laws to ensure that they have federal dollars to do it right. So to pour those dollars into law enforcement so that they are the very best at approaching a home and a respondent who's going through a crisis, making sure that communities are educated on the warning signs and to know to use a law like CAR. And so that legislation passed with bipartisan support. There were 50 Democrats in the U.S. Senate that voted aye and 15 Republicans that did. And so, that piece of pushback in my mind is not valid, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Right. You talked about Whitney Strong from the standpoint of initiatives, over the last 5 or so years that you guys have put in place. Clearly, the work on legislation is so important. And that's kind of a longer term, probably ongoing.
We like
forever.
to say a marathon.
Right? It's for forever kind of thing. Talk about some of the other initiatives that you all have spearheaded as well, in addition to the education. I know there's some very specific things that you've done from a safety perspective, processes around saving people's lives. Can you talk to some of that? Because it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, we at Whitney Strong take a two-pronged approach to this issue. Everything needs to be evidence-based and rooted in common ground. I've already talked quite a bit about the legislation, and by the way, failed to mention that national polling and Kentucky polling, we've done our own polling, show that the broad majority of both Democrats and Republicans support this policy. In fact, in Kentucky, we polled Republican primary voters, and in Kentucky, 72% of Republican primary voters support CAR. So That's how we do legislation. On the other side of the coin is community level change. And that came about because we didn't like the idea of having our hands tied behind our back with people telling us, well, the only way you can make change on this issue is to pass laws. I hear you, but there are other ways to make change. So we looked into a lot of the evidence-based trainings out there that really circle around the issue of gun violence. And if you believe that gun violence is accidents with our kids, it's suicide with guns, it's domestic violence, it's mass violence, there are a lot of different trainings available to you. And we landed on 3 for now: suicide prevention training, stop the bleed training, and firearm safety training. And the suicide prevention training, for the most part, is QPR. And I don't know if you're familiar with that. It stands for Question, Persuade, Refer. But it does teach lay people to recognize the warning signs of suicide, to practice having conversations with someone who does have suicidal thoughts, help persuade them to find help with a professional, and then to be educated on what mental health resources are available within the community. So we do that training. We also do Stop the Bleed, which teaches people how to apply pressure, use tourniquets when someone has uncontrolled bleeding. And yes, of course, that's because of gun violence, but it could also be an automobile accident or falling off a ladder. And there have been a number of studies, sadly, that have shown people die in mass shooting events because they don't have anyone there to control their bleeding. Pulse is one of the studies I always cite because that building was really protected. They couldn't get in immediately after that shooting. And this study through NPR showed, and I believe the number was somewhere around 17 people would have lived if there were tourniquets in the building. And so we teach that. And then lastly,
and
we
you're
teach...
also providing the materials? And
Yes. So every training comes with the tools necessary to, do the thing that you've learned with Stop the Bleed. You get a Save a Life kit. If you go through suicide prevention, it's information on the warning signs. We'll distribute a gun lock if you are a gun owner. And then the last training is about safe handling and safe storage. So if you've chosen to be a gun owner, this is the training for you. And it's the rules of safe handling as well as the rules of safe storage. And we distribute gun locks through that training as well.
Wow. And for us at St. Vincent de Paul, we're constantly faced with challenges from a mental health perspective. And, we do our best to train our folks on the warning signs and the de-escalation and those kinds of things. But I could see where that could be very valuable, not only for us as providers, but just for commercial businesses.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're actually, this program is called Save a Life, and we follow the data and we take it to the neighborhoods that need us most. So in Louisville and Cincinnati, well, specifically in Louisville, almost all the neighborhoods we serve are in the West End, although we've expanded to the 10 neighborhoods with the highest numbers of shootings, and so that's taken us elsewhere, like Newburgh, et cetera. In Cincinnati, those neighborhoods are dispersed more sporadically throughout the city. And then we're now a year into our first rural pilot, which is the opposite side of the coin, going into Gallia, Ohio, because they have the highest rates of suicide. And so that's much more of a rural population. We're going where the data takes us. If somebody wants these trainings and the data doesn't take us to them, then they can have it, but we offer it for a fee.
Yeah.
So we are doing what you said, and that's really just beginning, and we've had a number of trainings so far.
Good. I can see where that would be, in demand.
Yeah, and the thing about suicide, there's so much focus on why, and that's really important. But what we bring through not only our suicide prevention training, but our safe handling and storage training is the how. So making sure that when someone is going through a suicidal crisis, no ifs, ands, or buts, that they do not have access to lethal means. And that doesn't mean just guns. It's many other means. But putting those 2 points together And I think what we found through our work is gun owners really understand that they have to safely store their firearms when there are children in the home. Universal, that's what we've got to do. We've got to protect our kids from grabbing the gun from the bedside table. But where gun owners fall down is they're not yet informed of the rising rates of youth suicide. They also don't understand the importance, they don't always understand the importance of making sure that suicidal people do not have access to firearms, and they stop safely storing once the kids get a little bit older. And so we work really hard to educate people on, look, you really need to always safely store. You could have someone in your home who's suicidal, you could have kids in your home, or you could have a criminal who breaks into your home or breaks into your car, and then they're using the gun against others, which is probably the reason you bought it in the first place, to use it for purposes of self-protection or self-defense. So we talk quite a bit about safe storage, and we've distributed over 13,000 gun locks at this point, and you know, I wish it were 113,000. So we'll keep going.
Yeah. You know, I mean, just thinking about the story in the book about the youth getting a piece of pie, and you talk about, you know, creating those barriers, but that was a point in time. You're talking about the car law. What would happen in those 7 days? And if it's as simple as a piece of pie or some other interaction, right? I mean, that's the purpose of that time frame, right? Is for something like miraculous like that, or even not miraculous, to happen in that time period.
That's right. It's about time and space plus support. And people get to that place of violence for different reasons. It could be that someone is truly going through a mental health crisis and is suicidal and needs mental health support. It could be that someone is in a bad place because of a divorce and the loss of a job. It could be that someone is in a bad place because of compounded trauma and they're in a very agitated state and they need support to get away from that. There's so many reasons that people get to this place. And so as to what support service or services is right for them, it's going to vary every time, but we've got to wrap our mind around this person needs help. This person needs help. And while they need help, they don't need access to a firearm. So let's do a temporary transfer and let's help them. And we can get them back to a place in which gun ownership is safe.
So talking about helping folks, lots, you know, we have lots of folks that tune in to this podcast, and you're an inspiration. You really are. And when you shared your story, and I really appreciate that you did that. At that time, 3 weeks later, you start Whitney Strong. You could have just done nothing, just said, I'm done. I'm going to just, I don't know, not even come out kind of thing. And, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, the physical aspects of what you went through, but there's also, you know, the trauma aspects and mental health and all those kinds of things. But you just made the decision to do what you did. And obviously with the help of others, you know, strong folks in your life too that have helped you with that. But talk about just your journey from the standpoint of perseverance and moving forward and saying, no, I'm not. I'm going to be a voice to this, and I'm going to be out there and do all these wonderful things that you're doing. Where does that strength come from? And what advice would you give to folks, too, that go through other very traumatic experiences to just not give up? There is the other side of this, you know, from a mental health perspective, certainly from a physical perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a lot of people like me in this gun violence prevention space, in that you've experienced gun violence in some way. Sadly, most of them have experienced it because they've lost a loved one, but they're coming at it from a place of trauma. And because you've seen trauma face to face, you don't want anybody else to experience it. And it's a really sad way to come into advocacy, and you wouldn't wish that upon anybody else, but it's a very powerful driver. You just simply don't want other people to see the hell that you've seen. For me, I am unique in that I saw the hell, but I got the heaven. I got to go back home to my babies and to my husband. And so for me, it was always, from the moment that I heard, you're a miracle, you were shot 12 times, none of the bullets had any major organs or arteries. For me, it was, oh my goodness, thank God. Thank God I'm getting everything that I wanted in that moment. And do I have an arm that waves in an odd way? Yes. Do I have a lack of strength in my right arm and I'm trying to get it back? Yes. Do I have pain in certain parts of my body? Yes. But that all pales in comparison to not being here and not being able to be a mother and a wife. And so for me, gratitude is what drives me every day. And I feel really fortunate that that's what drives my work when so many people in this space are driven by their trauma and not being able to get back to their loved ones. Right. So I think the advice I would give, to the extent that it's applicable, which again is not applicable to people who have lost someone, is try to root yourself in gratitude, and it is a powerful driver for being able to do a lot of things in life.
Well, that's wonderful advice. Thank you for sharing that. We're talking about individuals that have experienced that sort of trauma. I had seen where you all had partnered with U of L to research gun violence. I think there was 20 participants under the age of 18 that had experienced that. So I just wanted to, as we're talking about this and the experience that folks have, what were some of the findings that came out of that study?
Yeah, thank you for bringing it up. I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to do this study, and I want more and more people to know about its findings. It was called a phenomenological study, and it was 20 survivors of gun violence. They were all shot in their youth, but some of them are adults now, so both youth voice and adult voice. And again, it was 20, and what it boiled down was 4 key themes that emerged from all of these interviewees. And I remember reading it the first time and thinking, these are my people. They understand what I understand, and there is just a special bond between people who have experienced this, but also some big differences between what they've experienced and what I experienced, not necessarily in a shooting, but really our life leading up to the moment of a shooting. And so the first was a belief that experiencing gun violence is expected. And so people don't know necessarily, but Black children and teens have a gun homicide rate that is 20 times higher than white teens. And so this plays into a community norm that gun violence is just part of our life. And so that's sadly what so many of these interviewees believed, that this was going to be a part of my life, no ifs, ands, or buts. And when asked as to why, they believe that gun violence is part of the status quo because of lack of activities available for young people, vacant and abandoned properties in their neighborhoods, unkempt yards, and littering. So that's one really depressing point of this study. The second, they all had traumatic experiences post-victimization. So the adults named what they were going through as PTSD. The youth didn't, but they're describing some of the same symptoms: difficulty with sleeping, insomnia, nightmares, not ever feeling completely safe, whether not feeling safe alone, not feeling safe with others, being hyper vigilant at all times about safety. This one is 100% me. I also don't ever feel totally safe. I'm always looking for my nearest exit, trying to make sure that I know the people around me, that I'm not in big crowds where I can't guarantee my safety. So that's not just people who have been shot in mass shootings. That is everyone who's been shot per this study. The third theme was shifting expectations and outcomes of life. There was an in vivo code that was used quite regularly, which is life is just different now. And I couldn't agree more. There was life until September 6, 2018, and then life after. And for so many of these interviewees, the physical impact of their shooting has totally changed their career trajectory. And with that has come depression, thoughts of hopelessness, really just a sadness for, I thought I was going to be able to do these things with my life, and now I can't because my body won't allow me to do that. There were a few instances where it was the opposite, that my shooting led to a new focus in my life, and my opportunities are now greater than what they were before. But by and large, most people talked about it being the opposite, that my mental health is really suffering because I can't do physically what I could do before. And then the last theme was views of what helps, and all the participants discussed support or lack thereof as a critical component to healing and working toward economic stability. They talked about the importance of having good support in the hospital system right after the shooting. And then also they talked about, interestingly, the importance of integrating trauma-informed practices into society. So whether it's the hospital or years down the road and now you have an employer, certain acts or behaviors can be misinterpreted if you are not a trauma-informed person. And the more we can become trauma-informed, the better it is for those of us who have experienced trauma to move through society. So those were the 4 key themes, and we were lucky enough to share those findings with the broader philanthropic community in Louisville, and we truly hope that those that are in a position to fund organizations directly supporting survivors, they have this information and more dollars go into those support services.
Well, I've seen some shift in that already in granting organizations, having more focus on that this year.
Well, good.
This year.
I always say I wish that we could do more to provide direct support. We're much more of a let's go upstream and make sure that nobody gets shot in the first place organization, and that, of course, is supporting survivors by decreasing the number of survivors that exist. But there are also many organizations that are doing the work directly, making sure that they have, for example, a car that has been retrofitted to ensure that someone in a wheelchair can now drive independently. I could give you many examples of direct support services, and they're really important for survivors.
It's interesting, and I'm glad I asked about it as well, because, the immediate place to jump to is those that did not survive, and you talk about those that didn't. But there's so many, probably more, I don't know if the data would say that have survived, and what has that done to their life. And when you message, so really important work. And so when you message on this, I bet a lot of the folks that were in the study also may have known someone that had been shot as well that didn't survive, if you talk about the demographics that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So they're dealing with that too, kind of thing. So it's just got to be really difficult.
I've not seen that exact question was asked, but I think it speaks to the first theme, which is gun violence is to be expected.
Yep.
And I've personally experienced it in these neighborhoods where we offer Save a Life. And it's rare that you come across someone and have a conversation that they haven't experienced gun violence. And now that's normal. It's never normal, but that's to be expected in these conversations in these neighborhoods. But I remember when I first started doing the work thinking, I can't believe that. You can ask my friends, and they don't know anybody other than me. But I go into this community, and they know all kinds of people. And that, of course, is a reflection of disproportionate impact. And I wish that, all of Louisville, all of Kentucky could have a line of sight into those conversations, because I think there would be much more empathy for, we have to do something about this.
Empathy. Yeah. And it's hard to build that. And we have the same challenge with the folks that we serve that are unhoused. There's all kinds of fixed positions and perceptions on who they are and all that. But as you start to expose others to the realities, my hope is that we can continue to build empathy, because then I think folks look at a situation differently. They may still have a perception, or not a perception, but a position or whatever. But if you can get there, then there's hope. So,
yes.
Amen to that.
Yes.
In terms of your education and these kinds of studies. So I want to wrap up, and I know you're a mom, and you've clearly probably had a lot of opportunities to talk to your own children. What advice would you give to other parents, guardians, others that have responsibilities for children? What advice would you give them in terms of the kinds of things that they should talk about, and just help their own children understand about gun violence, and because they've got friends that may be challenged and all that kind of stuff. But what would you tell parents? How should they go about that?
Well, I am not a child psychologist, but I've read what a lot of them say on this topic. And what I've learned and then applied myself is that you should let the children lead. You should not lead. So, for example, if you lead, you may go too light or too heavy on the subject matter, depending upon where your child is developmentally. If you allow them to lead, you understand what they know and what they don't know. And it's really not effective to ignore and distract. You should be direct in your answers, but you should also do what you can to make children feel safe, because after all, that's what they want. And so one of the things that I say quite often to parents or to my children is, I know that you're worried about school shootings, but there are still very few school shootings happening across the country. And your teachers and your principal and all the adults in your school and around your school are doing everything they can to keep you safe, because they love you and they care about you. And so mommy's going to continue to do everything I can to keep you safe. Mm-hmm. So I'm being honest that it does happen and that it is scary, but the adults are doing everything they can to keep you safe. And I wish I could say something like, and you're totally safe forever, because we've put enough controls in place to protect our children. And I believe we will get to that place someday where school shootings are so few and far between, mass shootings are few and far between the way they were 30 plus years ago, but we're just not there. And that requires everybody to lean in, from school administrators doing everything they can to increase safety in their schools, to all the way up to lawmakers doing everything that they can to increase safety in our schools.
Whitney, thank you. Where can people go to get more information on Whitney Strong?
Thank you. If you are the kind of person who likes to keep up with things on social media, we're very active there. Our handle is @whitstrong.org. Or if you'd prefer to get your information through email, you can go to whitneystrong.org and choose Get Informed and give us your email address, and then you'll get all our communications through email. You can also peruse the website. There's plenty there about Save a Life and CAR and other pieces of information about us as an organization.
You're truly a blessing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.